increasing cancer rates among young people. Is there any truth to the fact that there's actually an increase?
You're probably referring to the latest report from the American Cancer Society with their 2024 statistics.
Welcome to the Nutrition Science Podcast, where we help you cut through the noise and make informed, science-based decisions about nutrition and your health. Welcome back to the show. Today, I brought my friend, Dr. Krystle Zuniga, onto the show to discuss the rising cancer rates among young people. If you're not familiar, early in 2024, there was a lot of headlines that were picked up by major media outlets highlighting rising cancer rates among young individuals among specific types of cancer. This has caused a lot of people to have anxiety around this topic, to want more clarification, and I brought Dr. Zuniga on today to discuss what's actually going on in terms of cancer rates, cancer trends, and what might be causing some of these increased rates among certain age groups for certain cancers. So we discuss this topic in depth. It is a really good episode. And if you're not familiar with Dr. Zuniga, I brought her onto the podcast before. She is a cancer nutrition specialist and a professor at the University of Texas. She has her PhD in nutrition as well. She's also a registered dietitian. So she teaches students and is also a practicing dietitian working with clients going through cancer treatment, and she has a lot of knowledge and wisdom to bring to the show. I've had her on before to discuss cancer nutrition myths, and the episode was called Can You Cure Cancer with Nutrition? I will put a link to that in the show notes, or you can scroll back on wherever you listen to podcasts and find that episode. It was early on. It was April of 2023. I believe it was like April 17th, somewhere around that date. And so if you scroll back to that date, you'll be able to find that episode, or you can just go to the show notes and you can find the link there. But you probably want to check that out after you listen to this episode, because as I mentioned earlier, Krystle is very knowledgeable in this topic. She has a lot of experience in this topic, and really she's my go-to person for cancer nutrition. And I recommend going to her first in terms of trying to find quality evidence-based information that you can trust, because she really cares about the information that she's putting out. She cares about people, and it's just really knowledgeable on the topic. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into the show. Welcome back to another episode of the Nutrition Science Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Adrian Chavez, and today I have my friend, Dr. Krystle Zuniga, on the show. If you have listened to the show for a while, you probably heard her on the show before. She was probably one of my first guests and also my first repeat guest. So you are listening to someone who is breaking the mold in the podcast in terms of coming back for a second time. But like I mentioned before, what I want to do is really kind of bring on the same experts and really help kind of introduce you to experts that you can trust and have a trusted resource in each topic, as opposed to trying to bring a whole bunch of new people on. And I've been getting a lot of questions about cancer and cancer rates increasing among young people. And I was going to do some reading on the topic, but I am not an expert in this field. So I decided to bring Krystle back on. So thanks for coming on, Krystle.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the honor of being a repeat guest, and it's great that your audience is asking these questions too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, cancer, we know, heart disease is the number one cause of death, but cancer is right behind it. And cancer rates are, about 1 in 2 adults, men, right? And then 1 in 3 women. Is that the correct statistics, are going to experience cancer in our lifetime?
Yes, those are the latest statistics.
Yeah. So I mean, if pretty much everyone listening to this is probably going to experience some sort of cancer within your own health or within someone close to you. And these topics are really important to understand and think about. And I know a lot of people are worried about a lot of the headlines that were coming out earlier this year about increasing cancer rates among young people. So let's dive into that. So is this just fear mongering in headlines, or is there any truth to the fact that there's actually an increase? Because for those of you who don't know, let me quickly go into it. So a few months ago, there was a lot of headlines that came out that were saying something along the lines of cancer rates are increasing among young adults. And that headline was very popular among different media outlets. And, it sounds scary. So we want to dig into what that actually means and what's really going on. So can you shed some light into this topic a bit for us?
Sure. Yeah. So you're probably referring to the latest report from the American Cancer Society with their 2024 statistics. And there was also some headline about this is the first time that cases are expected to exceed 2 million in the US, which that's related to, we have an aging population and a growing population. But it's important that we look at not just those absolute values and look at trends. when we look generally, the trend, the observed rates are about 9% lower. So we're actually starting to see small decreases in cancer incidence. But where it still is concerned, though, again, we want to look not just that big number, go into what's happening. And there are some increases in particular subgroups too. So although we are making progress in survival and starting to see reduced rates, when we look at some subgroups, yes, we are seeing an increase in incidence. And one particular concern is this increase in colorectal cancer in those younger than 55. And this is not brand new. We've actually been seeing this trend for quite a while.
Let me
Every
back
year.
up really quickly because
Yeah.
I think you said some things that we may need to clarify a bit. So, couple of points that you pointed out that I really want to highlight is there is actually increasing total numbers of cancer cases. So when you hear that, you'll think cancer rates are going up, but statistics can be manipulated in many ways. I talk about this on the show quite a bit. And so you can present that as cancer rates are increasing, but the reality is the age of the population is increasing. And when we adjust those cancer rates based on the age of the population, cancer rates are actually going down. Is that what you were saying that the statistics are showing?
Right, that we look at that overall number, it's the largest number we've ever seen. But then when we look at the actual rate, because we have a growing population, right? So we have to look at the number versus the total population, and that has been a decrease.
Okay. Okay. So total numbers higher, amount per person is lower, and then if we adjust that, I'm guessing we adjust that further by age, it's also going down as well because the population is growing and aging as well.
Well, that's where it gets a little tricky too, because there's actually starting to see a decrease in incidence of older adults. And
Okay.
so that might be why we're seeing this overall decrease in incidence, because we're seeing less cancer cases in the older adults. But what's concerning is an increase in some particular cancers.
Okay. Okay. So overall, total numbers of cancers has increased, but that's only because the total population has increased. Per person cancer rates have gone down a little bit. That seems to be driven by a little bit lower rates of cancer among older adults. However, there is a concerning increase among younger adults, which is what we're going to discuss further here. Does that
Yeah.
put
Yeah,
the thought?
exactly.
Okay.
That is
We're
important.
explaining
Exactly.
this.
And I love that, like, you're thinking beyond that headline, because that headline can seem really scary. And I remember seeing that headline, like the most cancer cases we've ever seen. But we've got to look at this as a percentage of the population and
And
not.
unfortunately, we cannot trust the media to present this data in a way that's actually unbiased. They're looking for the sensational angle, and they're looking for, okay, cancer rates are going up among young people. The total number is going up. They're focusing on these small pieces of the overall picture and trying to sensationalize it to scare you. Unfortunately, that's what it sounds like based on this description. And honestly, when I saw that, I was a little bit concerned myself. And I was like, I'm curious as to what's driving that, what's going on. And again, rather than reading the data, I figured I could just have a discussion with you and that would make it easier.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you clarified that because I truly personally was like, what's going on here? So let's talk about the increasing cancer rates among young people. So is it total cancers? Is it certain cancers? What's going on there?
Yeah, and it's also important to look at, yes, this is alarming, and not to diminish that this is something that we need to be paying attention to and trying to understand why we're seeing an increase in this younger age group, because cancer is really a disease of aging, something that we'll see primarily in older adults. But to also put this in context, that when we say younger adults, sometimes there's different cutoff points, but we're going to talk about it relative to the age of 50. That still represents only about 12% of all cancers is occurring in individuals younger than 50. Right. And then when we look at, well, what is really driving this increase that we're seeing in young adults, it seems to be colorectal cancer, and also in women, breast cancer. That's what we're seeing. So both of those are increasing. Colorectal cancer is the number one cause of cancer related deaths in men. It's number two in women of cancer related deaths. So be specific there. as well. So there's still, these are just some data to pay attention to. There's not really a strong understanding of why this is happening.
Yeah. And I've seen you mention before as well, this headline has come out, but this is something that has been a trend for quite some time now.
Yes. Yep. We've been seeing the colorectal cancer trend for at least a decade.
Okay. Okay. And I know it's just speculation, but what are some things that you think may be contributing? What are some primary risk factors of colorectal cancer that may be, potentially playing a role in this increase?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of, like I said, kind of some speculation or discussion, but what we do know about factors, risk factors for colorectal cancer, there's definitely lifestyle factors that can be associated with that. So looking at things like obesity, alcohol intake, diets that are low in fiber, diets that are very high in more processed meats. I know we can touch on that a little bit later, but also sedentary activity as well. So we see that colorectal cancer seems to very much align with lifestyle factors that we see an increased risk with things like obesity and alcohol, diet quality, and that could be explaining some of it. Um, we also, there's some speculation about very early life exposures because some of these things like lifestyle factors, it's not like you have a low fiber diet for a couple of years and then you're going to get colorectal cancer. This is something that accumulates, right, over time, these exposures. And so they're really starting to pay attention to what might be happening in very early life that could be related to this. So, for example, maybe antibiotic use very early in life that could disrupt the microbiome. Even some speculation about, or a little bit of data that obesity, mother that has obesity, her child is at greater risk of colorectal cancer. There's been one study that found that. So it might be even exposures before someone is born. So just want to put it out there that yes, we have some lifestyle factors that are related, but there's still a lot of research looking into what could be happening much earlier in life contributing to this risk.
And when it comes to colorectal cancer, how much of a role does nutrition play? I know lifestyle plays a role overall, but the way I see digestive issues overall is like nutrition plays a big role because it's, your digestive system has to process all your food and it's the first level of exposure to all your foods.
Mm.
The first thing I think of when I think of digestive and anything in that area that has to do with the intestines and digestion, I think of, food usually does play a big role. Do we have any data on the percentage that nutrition may be contributing to overall colorectal cancer, or are you familiar with that?
That's a good question. I don't know what the exact like percentage of modifiable risk we have from diet and specifically, unfortunately. But I'd say absolutely agree with that there are several dietary factors that are associated with colorectal cancer, as you mentioned. The digestive tract is seeing anything that you put into your mouth.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
also how it correlates or interacts with the microbiome, and that we know that the microbiome could be playing a role as well.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, your diet determines your microbiome. Well,
mhm.
your early life exposures, as you mentioned, like your exposure to different microbes in your environment and through siblings and pets and all of that, but also your dietary intake, your fiber, your saturated fat, your sugar, your sodium, all contribute and shape the composition of your microbiome. They shape your digestive tract. They contribute to the health of your digestive tract to a pretty great degree. So from a modifiable risk standpoint, it seems like nutrition may be one of the biggest factors for reducing risk of colorectal cancer. So you mentioned, and we kind of touched on this a little bit. So like higher fiber diets are helpful. What are some other things that are associated with lower rates of colorectal cancer that have been shown in the literature?
Yeah, sure. Kind of to further explain the fiber association, that one fiber can help promote motility. So any exposure to anything from our environment, it helps to get these things out of the body. That's a detoxification route, as well as the liver through interhepatic circulation is trying to get rid of toxins through that route too. So having regular bowel movements is a way to help, again, eliminate those things, and as well fiber being a source of fuel for having a good diverse microbiome that can produce some postbiotics that help support the intestinal health. Also, have been shown to those postbiotics support the immune system. So, all in all, a good symbiotic
And
relationship.
quickly, because I know there's people who are listening who are gonna say, "What in the world is a postbiotic?"
Oh,
So, I discuss what this is in the microbiome episode that I
mm,
published, but a postbiotic is essentially the compounds that are produced by the microbes in our guts. We have 40 trillion microbes or something like that living in our digestive tract. When we eat fermentable foods, carbohydrates, fiber sources, those microbes break down those fuel sources and they produce compounds that are called postbiotics. And a lot of the benefits or potentially negative effects of our gut microbiota, like the effects that they have on the health of our intestinal tract, on our immune health, on our health in general, are mediated by these postbiotic compounds, these compounds that they produce. So a lot of people think it's actually the microbes that are having the benefit. Well, the microbes don't actually have much of a benefit unless they're able to come into contact with these prebiotics and produce these probiotic compound or postbiotic compounds. And some of the research now is kind of leaning towards, focusing on these postbiotic compounds as opposed to the probiotics, and
mm,
trying to isolate these postbiotic compounds and use those as like a therapeutic mechanism because it's more targeted. Because what we're doing a lot of times when we're putting these probiotics in is we're hoping that they produce these postbiotic compounds, and they may not because the environment may not be appropriate for them. They may not survive in the gut. They may not, for a variety of reasons, produce these postbiotic compounds. So if you are interested in learning more about that topic, I recommend checking out my microbiome episode. I will post a link to that in the show notes. But I know that, someone tuning in, you hear postbiotics, and that's not just a term that is thrown around regularly. I know that sometimes we forget that not everyone is familiar with these terms, and as you said that, I was like, oh, I'm sure someone's listening who doesn't know what that is.
yeah, and thanks for clarifying that, right, and explaining that they are it's not just having bacteria, that's good, it's what they're producing that's helping us, and to understand too that for them to be beneficial, it does matter what we are feeding it. Because like another potentially negative thing that can happen is for diets that are really high in fat, you need bile for that fat absorption, right? And these bile acids can end up in the large intestine, and the bacteria can also produce these secondary bile acids, which can be potentially harmful to the intestine. So it does matter what you're feeding them. Just having bacteria there doesn't automatically mean you're getting benefits. It's what you feed it and what it puts out. And then how is that going to help support your intestinal health or be detrimental to your intestinal health?
Yep, definitely. And as Crystal just mentioned, like there is data to support the idea that diets very high and particularly saturated fats can increase the amount of these secondary bile acid metabolites, and these have negative effects on the gut. They can contribute to inflammation and potentially, are helping to, contribute to overall risk of colorectal cancer and other digestive issues as well. And sometimes, bile acid, medications that sequester these bile acids are necessary for some people who have, malabsorption issues and who are or potentially producing a lot of these secondary bile acid metabolites.
Yes. Yeah. And that's potentially one of the mechanisms by which, kind of looking at dietary factors again, how red diets high in red meat might be associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer. Part of it could be related to that dietary pattern that might have a higher saturated fat intake. And as you mentioned there, that could be one of the potential mechanisms by which it is increasing the risk.
Let's talk about that more because I know that's a topic of a lot of controversy. So red meat increasing risk of colorectal cancer. Is there risk involved with any consumption of red meat, or is there a certain threshold? What's going on there? Is red meat really associated with colorectal cancer? Is this, just noise in the data? What's your opinion there?
I know it is very controversial. People don't like to hear it. And I like to put that into pattern that the recommendation, cancer prevention recommendation, is not zero red meat. And that's not what the guideline is. It's actually at very high intake. So recommendations are to stay around 16 to 18 ounces per week. The less, the better for sure. But this was classified by IARC as a group 2 carcinogen, red meat. But maybe you've already talked about this in your podcast. Just because something's labeled a carcinogen, it's more of what is the dose, right? And the amount and the magnitude of that effect. So in that report, they found a 17% increase in colorectal cancer for every 100-gram portion of red meat eaten daily. So that'd be like 3.5 ounces eaten every single day. And that being associated with 17% increased risk. And again, we look at these numbers like, oh, that sounds high, but you have to put it into context of, well, how many total colorectal cancer cases are there? And what is that actual magnitude of risk?
Yeah. Okay. And so, like you said, putting it into context, so 17% increased risk. Last I checked, the total population incidence of colorectal cancer is somewhere around 4%. Is that are you familiar with that data?
Oh, off the top of my head, I can give the exact number.
Okay. Yeah, last I checked, it was about 4%. So when you increase 4% by 17%, that means like your total lifetime incidence would be, go from you have a 4% chance of getting colorectal cancer throughout your life to about a 5% chance of getting colorectal cancer throughout your life. So it's not insignificant because we do want to reduce our risk of we want to reduce our risk of all of these things as much as possible. And at the end of the day, we're looking at, and I know this can get complicated when we start talking all these statistics, but at the end of the day, we're looking at, you know, you got to think about colorectal cancer, breast cancer, and all. It's hard to really break everything down and worry about every single 17% or 12% or 6% increased risk. The reality is, a lot of the stuff like we talked about on the podcast, it's going to reduce your risk of eating more fiber, eating more fruits and vegetables, and if you're doing a lot of the right things, really worrying about every little, you know, increasing, or because a lot of times people ask me, well, how do I reduce my liver cancer risk, or how do I reduce my, and if you have like some genetics that are making you at very high risk for that disease, then that may be a reason why you would want to do that. But if you're just normally living your life, focusing on living a healthy lifestyle versus trying to reduce your risk of this and this and this and this is going to be much easier and is going to be much less stressful, and is most of the stuff to reduce your risk of colorectal cancer is the same stuff to reduce your risk of diabetes, is the same stuff to reduce your risk of heart disease. The same stuff we're talking about. Eat more fiber. That reduces your
Yep.
risk of heart disease, reduce your risk of diabetes, reduces your risk of Alzheimer's. Pretty much every chronic health condition, is going to be improved from that. And so, you know, sometimes we'll get into some weeds about focusing on some of these things and different percentages and things, and it can feel like it's a little bit overwhelming. But at the end of the day, we want to step back and look at overall healthy lifestyle patterns and more focus on overall living a healthy lifestyle and the components that go into that, rather than trying to play whack-a-mole with every little health condition that may occur in the future. Because you can get, I mean, if
Yeah.
you're trying to reduce your risk of autoimmune disease and cancer and diabetes, and you're thinking about all these things at one time, and you're trying to do all these different, you know, lifestyle habits and dietary habits to reduce your risk of each of these, it's going to feel overwhelming. And I've seen people do that. I've seen people ask
Yeah.
questions in that way. I've had conversations with clients in that way who are like, well, how do I reduce my risk of this and then this? And I'm like, just focus on the execution of the healthy lifestyle and the things that we know to be overall beneficial, because that's really, 90% of it is going to come from moving more, eating more fruits and vegetables, eating more fiber, just paying attention to your nutrition overall, like, and just being intentional with that and planning ahead and all of that. So, don't want to get people too worried about
No,
this
no.
17% increase rate.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And I think you put that too to explain that there's limitations when we look at this. Like, this is not that there were randomized controlled trials where they fed escalating doses of red meat and then saw who developed colorectal cancer. We're looking at observational studies. And so there's limitations within that. What could a dietary pattern very high in red meat also correlate with? It might correlate with having less plant in the diet and fiber and diversity. So it's hard to tease that stuff out. Right. So there's a lot more research now looking at dietary patterns and their association with cancer, because I think, as you mentioned, people can get really caught in the weeds looking at every individual food. So try to put this into the context of a lifestyle pattern.
And as you mentioned, high consumption of red meat, especially fatty red meat, is associated with higher rates of colorectal cancer and pretty much everything else. And that's why I'm not, I'm not one of these people who say, red meat is a health food. It is a nutrient dense food that has some downsides, and eat consuming it in moderation, probably, little to no risk involved with that. As Crystal mentioned, about a pound a week of lean red meat, probably little to no risk involved with that. If you're going over that, there's probably going to be some risk, especially if you're genetically prone to colorectal cancer or heart disease. And we mentioned, from the bile acid and the saturated fats, that can be one of those mechanisms that can potentially increase colorectal cancer risk. But there's also other mechanisms as well when it comes to red meat, like the mutagenic compounds that are produced when red meat is charred. So if you're not
Yep.
familiar with this, like when we char meat, it creates these compounds, these polycystic aromatic hydrocarbons and advanced glycation end products and other compounds that are referred to as mutagenic compounds. They can damage our DNA. And so this is, and I know this sounds scary. I'm not going to try to, we're going to put this into context, but when we cook, these red meats under high heat and we create that charring effect on the outside, that actually creates the production of these compounds, and that is thought to be one mechanism through which these red meat may be increasing cancer risk.
Yes, exactly. Yep, that's one concern too. The heterocyclic amines that can be formed. You talked about the secondary bile acids. Also, heme iron. Red meat's very high in heme iron. There's been some associations with high heme iron intake and its association with increased risk. So to understand that it's multifactorial. So I've heard people say, well, I only eat organic meat or grass fed, or I don't char my meat. Well, understand that the organic part of it and grass fed actually has nothing to do with the potential mechanisms of the colorectal cancer risk. And we need to still be cautious of it. And heterocyclic amines, okay, you don't char your meat. That's great. That's a great way to try to reduce exposure to those compounds. But still, like the heme iron, secondary bile acids could still be playing a role.
Yeah.
So we have to yeah, say, well, I don't do this, so I'm fine. Again, trying to limit that and have diversity in your animal protein. I mean, there's been some, again, observational studies, but doing some substitution analysis and found that substituting some white meat for red meat was associated with reducing the risk of colorectal cancer and breast cancer. So trying to swap out, this isn't like you can never have animal proteins. It's more of just trying to limit the red meat.
Yep, and looking the red meat, and even, sometimes swapping some of that for some beans and lentils is gonna be
Yes.
beneficial as well, because then you can get some fiber, and that's something that a lot of people. I talked about this in a recent podcast episode. I did a podcast episode with Dr. Matt Nagra, and, we talked about, increasing plant-based, how to increase, more plant foods in your diet, and if you wanna go fully plant-based, some strategies for doing that, but I I know a lot of people may think, listening to this, like, I'm anti-red. I love red meat. I enjoy it. I grew up in Texas. Like, barbecue is a big thing in our culture. And the reality is, like, when you look at the data, it's pretty clear. There is no like evidence that supports eating a diet that has a high amount of red meat in any positive health outcomes. Like there's no research that shows that, where like people who eat more red meat have, well, actually there are some studies, but they are out of Asia where red meat consumption is extremely low, and the people who eat very high amounts of red meat in those studies eat less than the low amounts in the US. And that's the reason that those
Oh,
associations exist, is because they're going from 0 to the 4 ounces a week or 8 ounces a week. And people will cite those studies and they'll show, "Oh, look, these people from China, the ones who eat more red meat, are better, have better health outcomes." And the reality is, like, because they're still eating very low amounts, and that red meat is providing some B vitamins, some iron, some creatine, some beneficial micronutrients, and that's the reason you would include some red meat in your diet, is you're going to get some zinc, some
yeah.
bioavailable iron, some B12. But if you're including a lot of that, there's some potential negative health risks associated with that, and you can meet your, you can help meet your nutrient needs with very small amounts. If you have a couple ounces per day, you can actually, almost meet your B12 needs and zinc and iron, like, add a sufficient amount of nutrition to your diet without having to eat so much that you're potentially increasing your risk. And again, at the end of the day, if you just like red meat and you want to eat it every day and you're like, you know what, I'm cool with the potential increased risk, like it's not going to be the end of the world. You're still like, if the rest of your diet is nutritious, it's probably going to increase your risk a very small amount over time, for cancer and heart disease. Like, it's not going to be this major difference. It's just, it's there.
Yeah.
And as a scientist, and I know Crystal is as well, like, I didn't look into this data thinking I want red meat to be unhealthy. It's when you look into the data, it just clearly shows that other sources of protein, other sources of animal protein, and then plant protein sources like lentils and edamame and tofu just have better health outcomes. They lead to better health outcomes overall in terms of cancer, heart disease, and other health outcomes. I didn't mean for this to be a red meat rant, but I see this all the time on social media right now. It's a trend.
Okay.
It's a trend right now among non-science based wellness accounts that pretend to be science based a lot of times. And they're just like, you know, red meat is healthy. And they'll talk about red meat is a health food because of these nutrients. And it's like, yes, good. It is nutritious. But there are negative effects of consuming too much of it. And, and then you hear the other, people try to take the argument of, well, it's natural and we've been doing it for millions of years. We never ate more than a pound of red meat a week in the millions of years we lived, and if we did, we didn't live long enough to get heart disease or cancer, so it didn't matter. Like, this evolutionary argument around it is just frustrating because
Yeah.
we just weren't eating that much. You weren't eating ribeyes. You weren't sitting down and eating a 16-ounce ribeye, 100,000 years ago. You were lucky if you killed an animal in most cases, like, once every few months, I bet, and depending on where your ancestors live.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, like, again, I've only talked about it a few times on my page, and there definitely is, like, people thinking that I'm gonna come to their house and take the steak out of the refrigerator. Like, it is perfectly fine to eat that. Just understand that there is this risk. This data does exist. If you don't want to cut out red meat, then that's like you said, there's other lifestyle factors that you can work within, but the data is there, right? And I get very similar pushback too when talking about processed meat. That is also part of IR labeled as a group 1 carcinogen that was associated with an 18% increase in colorectal cancer risk for every 50 grams per day. So that's more of like 1.5 or a little more than 1.5 ounces per day every day, right? And processed meat does include deli meats and smoked meats. And I do understand, though, that there is limitations within that data because I feel like it is challenging to put like sliced turkey in the same category as bacon. But that is a limitation of observational data. They sometimes aren't able to get into the minutia of what is the processed meat that's being consumed. But even whether it's bacon or turkey, deli meat, for example, one of the compounds we are concerned about are potentially nitrosamines. Same thing where they can be mutagens, right, when they reach the gut. So just saying there again, if you don't want to get rid of your deli meat, that's there too. But understand that is something where there has been an association. And unfortunately, there isn't really kind of digging into the details of separating out the different types of processed meat.
Yeah, let's
Yeah.
discuss that a little bit because I have had this conversation a few times. So what you mentioned is that there's an 18%. So this one's labeled as a group 1 carcinogen because the relationships are stronger and more well established. So when it comes to processed meats, and processed meats include things like sausage, bacon, potted meat, spam, but also within that same category is like things like sliced turkey and deli meat. And the reason this is the case is because just the way that we do nutrition research is we have to ask about categories of foods because it's difficult to ask people about every single individual food that they eat. So this is because a lot of the research, the way that it's done is it categorizes these foods into this category. And a long time ago, people weren't really thinking about the potential implications of the various differences of the foods in this category. Sometimes it's easy to say they should have done this, later on, but back then, they probably just weren't considering it in that way. And so now we have lots of data showing an association between these processed meats, and there's various reasons why. One of them is that nitrates are used in the processing, and these compounds can be converted into what are called nitrosamines in our gut. And these nitrosamines can they're mutagens. They can have negative effects, just like these compounds that can be created from the charred meat. So when we're consuming more of these processed meats, that risk is potentially there. It's more likely to be driven by bacon, sausage, and some of these other things, but just understand that if you are consuming deli meat, that's where the data is, and there's just a limitation of knowing whether or not deli meat is potentially a factor in helping to drive that risk. One of the things that I've had that conversation dozens of times with clients, and I'm
Yep.
like, if this is a easy source of protein and you're, including it and you understand the potential risk, in many cases, it makes sense to include some of these things in your diet, even though
Mhm.
the risk involved. Like even, for example, and this is another thing that we need to discuss anyway, is processed foods. So yes, there are risks involved with eating processed foods versus not. If we look at the data, the lower the processed food consumption, the better the health outcomes. But that doesn't mean that we have to avoid processed foods altogether, because they can play a role in a health promoting diet as long as we're taking into consideration all of our overall nutritional needs and trying to do our best to, include the things that are going to help modify our risk in a way that's going to be sustainable for us.
Yep. Couldn't have said it better. Like, we gotta look at the big picture
Yeah.
here.
And so let's talk about processed foods, because that one comes in a lot too. And I know that when it comes to colorectal cancer, there's relationships there that are pretty strong. So what's going on there?
Right. So seeing some associations with diet high and ultra processed foods, and not only colorectal cancer, it's seen with some other types of cancer as well. And right, it could be a combination of things. Because when we say ultra processed foods, that could mean a whole variety of things. That could include whole grain cereals that are maybe just more refined versus chips or food like products, for example. But it's, something to take into context of like, well, who is eating an ultra processed food diet high in very ultra processed foods, then yeah, there's probably not the whole foods, the things that we've talked about, like that are rich sources of fiber and polyphenols and antioxidants and those things. So it might be more of what is it displacing in the diet that has the health promoting benefits. So kind of bringing it back to what you talked about earlier is looking at the whole diet, the whole context of that diet. And is it just you're eating primarily whole foods and then, hey, you're having an ultra processed cereal because that's easiest in the morning for you? That's not what we're concerned about. Right? It's when the
I
diet is
had
heavily rich.
processed cereal before this meeting, or before this.
Oh, what happened is still standing. Yeah.
And
Wow.
now that you mention it, I definitely I was it's been a long time since lunch, and dinner's gonna be until after this, and I'm like, okay, I need something right now. And an ultra processed cereal was convenient for me, and it got the job done. So yeah, taking into context the whole picture, and as you mentioned, and I have a podcast episode giving the specific categories of ultra processed foods and what that means. And I think I talk about this in almost every podcast of like the different, like, just because something's ultra processed doesn't mean it's unhealthy. It's really the characteristics of that food. Is that food high in saturated fat or other types of added fats? Is it high in sodium? Is it low in fiber? Does it have a lot of additives and coloring agents and texturing agents and things like that that yes, may be fine in small doses, but if we're consuming that as a part of our diet on a regular basis in larger quantities, probably not going to be beneficial to our health, especially because one of the things that I look at is when we're looking at ultra processed foods versus whole foods, the additives in ultra processed foods, it's like the texturing agents and coloring agents and flavoring agents and all these different things that are meant to make it more palatable and just make it more desirable for us so that we overeat it. That is like displacing the micronutrients in like whole foods. Like if you eat a whole food, like say for example, you eat, a bowl of fruit, you're gonna be getting a wide variety of micronutrients in that bowl of fruit. And when you're eating a processed food, you're gonna be replacing that typically with a lot of, chemical compounds that have been tested to be safe and are fine as long as you're consuming those things in smaller quantities, but you're replacing micronutrients with those things is going to lead to a negative health effect over time if you're doing that with a large percentage of your diet.
Yeah, and like you said, the characteristics, right? The saturated fat, the sugar, the sodium, those are all things that we need to consider rather than just say anything that's processed is bad. I mean, you've probably seen this too. I have people that are worried about canned beans or the yogurt. It's a level of processed. Like, yes, there's some processing that we need to have these things be on our shelves and accessible for us, but that's very different.
I
There's
can't think
different.
the number of people that I know that won't eat pasta or like bread.
Mm.
That like the number I probably like quote unquote like given permission to clients like to eat pasta
Interesting.
like on a regular basis. They're like, "Do you ever eat pasta?" I'm like,
Yeah.
"That's one of my favorite carbohydrate sources."
Yeah.
Like, it's high in fiber, has a decent amount of protein. We
Sure.
get a whole wheat pasta. It has a little bit of magnesium, some B vitamins. Like, we tend to just really look at some of these things that have just been demonized by certain wellness influencers. A lot of people just have the wrong relationships with these things to where you're scared to eat things that are perfectly healthy, like soy.
Yeah.
Speaking of, let's talk about that, and let's pivot a bit because we've been talking about colorectal cancer, and you also mentioned that there's a slight increase in breast cancer risk. And so I know that probably most of what we talked about when it comes to colorectal cancer also applies to breast cancer, but I'm sure there's some other things as well. And one of them probably happens to be, soy and phytoestrogens.
Yeah, that's a comment. So to correct on that data, yes, there's been an increase in premenopausal breast cancers. Interestingly, obesity is not designated to be a risk factor for premenopausal breast cancer, so I can't really pin it on that. There does seem to be a protective effect of having more children and having them before 30. So as we're seeing this change and when women are having children, that could be one potential risk factor. I hate when that's listed as a modifiable risk factor. Just want to put that out there.
Have more children.
Yeah, to have more children or to have them earlier. It's like, no, no, no. We're not going
There
to talk
are
about
easier ways to reduce your risk
Yeah.
as a parent. I
Yeah, I was like listed on like the CDC website or something where it's put as modifiable. Like, in what world is that? But I get that we just have to recognize, yeah, that's a risk factor. And we're seeing changes in breastfeeding rates and we could get into all the politics of that, but we have to understand that is a risk factor and that could be one of the potential contributors. And we can't really put it on obesity in this particular case. But still lifestyle factors like fiber intake, physical activity levels, could be related as well. And yes, the dietary factors of high fat diets, low fiber diets, high red meat, those types of things. Yes, those cancer prevention recommendations we generally see are aligning with reducing the risk of several types of cancer.
Yeah.
And
So
yeah.
I mentioned soy. Does that play a role in
Mhm.
protection or increasing risk of breast cancer?
Yeah. Yeah. And when this myth will go away that's saying that soy is bad because the data has shown soy to be protective for breast cancer. And even for those that have had a diagnosis of breast cancer, that soy intake being associated with lower risk of recurrence and better overall mortality. So the data has been pretty consistent of the benefits of soy. I mean, I say worst case is that it does nothing, but the data has shown actually protective effects. So either nothing or protective as far as reducing the initial risk, as well as for even, yes, hormone sensitive cancers, that there be a benefit of soy intake so that these phytoestrogens, and that was the concern is, oh, they have this compound in them that could act like estrogen. It is not the exact same compound as estrogen. This is a different compound or has a similar structure, but it's not working at that same level. And we are concerned about perhaps soy isoflavone extracts or things that are very high in these phytoestrogens that are more isolated. But when we're talking about food, soy foods, it has been shown to be protective. So, yeah, you're on top of just doing it. Yeah,
That's
people.
never gonna go away. I don't think and here's the part that like it's why it's really important, and I emphasize this a lot on my social media, but I probably emphasize this a lot here as well. But it's so important to get your information from the right people. So currently the trends in the wellness space are red meat is healthy, soy is terrible for you, and the reality is the opposite. Like all of the data supports the opposite conclusions. Very clearly, like the data very clearly shows protective effects or worst case, no benefits of soy consumption. It's the opposite with red meat. Either no effect or negative. And the messaging that you're getting, if you're getting information from popular wellness, influencers on social media, and probably every popular podcast for the most part, besides a couple of select ones, they're telling you the opposite. And it's not supported by data at all. And
Yeah.
it's unfortunate. Like it frustrates me when I see this stuff and it's, we're not paid shills for the soy companies or anything like that. We're just two people who spent our lives studying nutrition. Crystal's a
Yeah.
professor. This is all she does is study and teach about nutrition, just like I have for my entire life. I'm been in this field for well over a decade. So is Crystal, and we have, this is what we do. We're not trying to manipulate data or have some certain message of where we're trying to, convince people to go vegan because the government wants to feminize everyone or anything like that. It's just if you want to improve your health and you want to do it based on the available data in the most, the way that's going to most likely get you to the place that you want to be in terms of improving your health, like, and based on data, this is what you need to be doing. Like, you need to be
Yeah.
following the recommendations that we're giving. And again, what we're doing is providing information. We're not sitting here like we're not going to go into your house and take your meat away. We don't care what, like at the end of the day, I really don't care what you eat. Like I'm not trying to convince you to eat a certain way. We're not trying to convince you to eat a certain way. We're trying to educate you so you can make informed decisions. That's the important piece. Like you need to be able to make informed decisions about your choices with the right information, because if you think you're making an informed decision and that informed decision is to avoid tofu at all costs and then, load up on red meat,
Yeah.
that informed decision is actually moving you in a direction that's opposite to where you're thinking it is. And that's the really unfortunate piece if you're not diligently vetting your sources. And that's why I'm very particular about who I bring onto this podcast. And you'll see that a large percentage of the people that I bring on have PhDs or MDs with a lot of also experience in nutrition, or we're talking about, medications and disease processes because that's what they're trained in, because it takes a long time to learn this stuff and understand it well to the degree that, you really need to be able to give accurate information.
Yeah, unfortunately, as you mentioned, there's people who are cherry picking studies to support their way of eating and to get other people to follow along and eat the way that they are. But it's really important to look at, well, that cherry pick study is against these guidelines, and these guidelines don't just come out of nowhere. This is experts that come together to evaluate the body of evidence, not just cherry picking studies that support this. And if anything, I think it's exciting that we have our dietary recommendations for cancer prevention align with what we recommend for management of diabetes or reducing the risk of heart disease. And it just shows that the body of evidence is so strong and that this is a dietary pattern that helps support overall health. And so I get a little frustrated, right, when two people are saying there's some conspiracy. I'm like, really? And all of these organizations are all getting together to support, right, big fruit and vegetable? Like,
I can't tell you how many times I've been, and I'm sure you've heard this too, but you're not as like active on social media busting myths as I am. But like, how many times I've heard like, oh, you have a PhD, you're like, you're brainwashed by food companies. And I'm like, they had absolute like food companies had no role in my training at
no.
all.
And
In a PhD, and I think I've talked about this on previous podcasts, but a PhD is you just pick a topic and learn about it. Like, and you're mostly not even going to class. It's mostly just independent research. Now, you do go to some classes and learn research methods and statistics, and you're under the guidance of mentors, but you generally your PhD is you pick a topic to specialize in, And your job is to learn as much as you possibly can about it and communicate that in the best way you possibly can. And you pick a set of advisors that evaluate you on your ability to do so. And during my PhD, I was focused on like insulin resistance and metabolic health and nutrition and lifestyle strategies for that. And like that's all I did for 4 years was read studies about, those topics, and it's like 4 whole years of reading about this topic, and now I feel confident enough to talk about insulin resistance, and then I get online and it's like so
You're
much
like, "Well, I
misinformation.
heard someone say this, so I know more than you do about even though you studied this." Yeah, and I'll say, right, I
Yeah.
studied nutrition and cancer for my PhD, and specifically in relation to prostate cancer. So I know quite a bit. So it is really frustrating to hear like this myth, and as you mentioned too, with all of this myth that leaves people confused. Like, oh my gosh, I heard I shouldn't eat red meat, and then now I can't eat soy, and like, what am I left to eat? And unfortunately, it really does get those important messages get lost, and then people don't know what to do. And I don't blame them for feeling confused. I feel confused too. I often take for granted my education and how I don't get caught up in that because I know better. Like I know that and I can tease that out, but not everyone has that type of training. And so as you're mentioning, like pay attention to who you're listening to. And if they're cherry picking studies that go against what we have of decades of guidelines based on body of evidence, you've got to kind of weigh that out yourself.
Yeah, definitely, and along with that, I know it's hard to identify quality sources sometimes, and so, there's good marketers are good at marketing and convincing
Mhm.
people that, certain things are true. So really look into the research, look into the credentials of people, because really, like you cannot learn this topic without education and experience working with people. Really, like both of those two. Like I would recommend that if you want to get quality advice from someone, make sure that they have extensive education, formal education, 6 plus years, master's degree, PhD, ideally. Now, if you're working with an RD, maybe not a master's degree. If someone's, just it has an RD that's going to be, they're going to be well trained, but science and research, master's degree or PhD is usually where we're getting deeper into that stuff and with experience of working with people because I had so many assumptions about how the world worked before I started actually working with people, and the the hands-on experience helps you to have better perspective about the advice that you give, because when I just was reading research, it's easy to get caught up in the weeds and get people focusing on minutia because I read a study that was really interesting, but the reality is like that's really hard for someone to actually implement. And we have to look at, okay, what does the research show? And then what's realistic for people to actually do? Because, you can optimize everything, but but then your life revolves around your health and you don't have time for other, well, not even your health. Of course your health is important, but like around your nutrition, and you don't have time for your work, your family, your hobbies, and any of these other things, and it can get overwhelming.
Yeah. And, to kind of put that back into the cancer context, I work with many people who have done everything that's within the cancer prevention recommendations and still develop cancer and develop cancer at a young age. And so to recognize too that these are just some things that we can help do to promote our overall health and reduce our risk of many chronic diseases. But this is not that you're never going to get cancer. We talked about the statistics on that. But unfortunately, like it's a reality of biology. Uh, that there can be cancerous cells that develop. And it's important not to get caught up in fear and feeling paralyzed to make any healthful dietary decision or swing on the other side and say none of this matters. See, but yeah, in my practice, I do see plenty of healthy people that develop cancer. And I always remind them this is not your fault and you did everything within your control to reduce your risk. It doesn't mean that that wasn't worth doing. You're coming into this with better health and you'll probably have better outcomes related to that. But again, it's not a guarantee. And I hate to put that out there too. When people do get cancer, sometimes people ask them, well, why? What did you do? Like this is not, these guidelines are not meant to be some type of, let me explain why you got cancer. There's still so much unknown. And just think of these as some, again, guidelines to just help guide your lifestyle choices.
Yeah, good point around the why too, because something that I think is important to emphasize is that cancer can occur due to like these genetic mutations that are happening in our cells, and our cells are just replicating, and there's so much going on in our body, and things are going wrong all the time, and our body's kind of fixing it and mitigating the damage, but um sometimes we just get unlucky with some of these things, and I see this, and it's really heartbreaking to see is oftentimes people are blamed for their cancer. They're like, "Oh, well, you shouldn't have done this." And I was probably more guilty of that when I was younger, in 20s, and reading all this research and saying, "Wow, you can almost completely reduce your risk by doing all these things." But the reality is that the complexities of the way that our body works, like, you can do everything right, and there's millions of different processes going on at one time, and if a couple of those go wrong, and it's amazing. Actually, like, when you really think about it from that perspective, like, there's millions of things going on in our body at one time, and all of these things have to continue to work together. Our heart has to beat, your cells have to continue replicating, your digestive cells have to turn over, they have to produce enzymes and break down your meals, you have to produce cortisol and testosterone and all these different, hormones within your body, and it's like your body's a pretty amazing machine. Like,
Yeah.
that's one of the things that I really enjoyed out of, really studying it to a deep degree, is like you become really fascinated and kind of grateful for the fact that, like, you're even able to wake up and breathe. It's like, wow, there's so much that goes into, like, just waking up and opening your eyes and taking a breath. Like, there's so much that just goes into that, and all of it has to continue to work correctly in order to keep you alive. In some miraculous way, it does so for, several years, and we're able to
Yeah.
just, like, develop and experience life through this vehicle.
And absolutely, it's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. And so also when you know that's like, yeah, I want to take care of this thing. This thing is pretty amazing. And to remember that, right? Like as amazing as it is, there's mistakes. And exactly that's why we have DNA repair mechanisms in place because damage occurs and we're exposed to things all over our environment and to not hyper focus on every possible thing. Again, really focusing on foundations and this is what you can control and take what you want from understanding these guidelines. And hopefully it helps people feel a little more empowered. And if you are feeling lost in the noise, bring it back to, well, who are you listening to try to filter out that noise.
Definitely. Speaking of, we're gonna end it there, but who are you listening to? Make sure you go follow Crystal on social media on Instagram. Her handle is, let me make sure I got this right, at Cancer Nutrition HQ.
Yes.
Okay, no underscores, no dots, nothing like that. Okay, no spaces. So Cancer Nutrition HQ. I will post the link in the show notes, but like we were just saying, make sure you get your information from the right people. If you're looking for information on cancer nutrition, make sure you reach out to Crystal, because she is a great resource, and she's someone that you can trust. She's not going to try to sell you some detox or tell you that she's going to cure your cancer and put you on some juice cleanse, and
None
that
of that.
these type of things are really dangerous, and you really want to avoid them. You want to get your information from the right people so that you can really protect your health as best as you can. So thanks for coming on, Crystal. We really appreciate it. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us.
Awesome. Thanks for the opportunity and the conversation.